So, welcome back to another episode of the Pack Podcast. Today we have Mr. Rajeev here with us. He has worked for decades in the oil and gas industry, particularly in finance, and made it all the way to CFO of a multinational company, focusing on drilling and oil extraction, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, no, thank you for the introduction and thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here and participate in your project and answer any perspectives or share any perspective that can bring value to this.
Right. Well, I wanted to start with your education. So, you were born and raised in India.
Yeah.
And your first taste of higher education was there. So, what was that like, and how did that influence
Yeah.
your next steps?
Yeah, it was way back then, and yeah, of course, as you said, I was born and brought up in India. My education was all completed there. I'm a chartered accountant by training, which I completed back in 1988, and since then, I've been sort of moving around the world with various countries, most of it with the same company.
Yeah.
So going back to the academics, I think back then the academics was actually quite prescriptive in terms of the curriculum and the choices that you had. So we followed that, but most of the learning actually came through the experience and practicing the knowledge that one gains, and this is what I strongly believe in. And I think the exposure that you get through visiting the world or meeting with different people, sharing perspectives, that's the learning that I think is more important.
So, after your chartered accountancy, what was your first taste of real world finance and industry?
Yeah, interesting. So I actually started my career by joining at the entry level in a public sector oil and gas company, ONGC, which was the only national oil company at that time in India. And so I was at the entry level at finance and accounts officer. A very, interesting work. I think one of my major recollection of my time at ONGC, which was not a long, it was about 3 years, was about the multidisciplinary training that actually they ran us through, right? I think a lot of national oil companies get a lot of bad press about, their way their working standards are or working philosophy is, but I quite enjoyed that. We had about a 4 to 5 months of multidisciplinary track where in the classroom we were taught everything about the oil and gas workflows, the business process, everything except accounting and finance, of course. And that I think gave me a very good perspective, which laid the foundation of what I am today. It obviously sparked a lot of curiosity during that time, which as the career progressed, I chased those questions and tried to find answers to that, right? So yeah, I think when we came out of the college, came out of my chartered accountant course, we were pretty raw, pretty fresh. But I think the foundation block that I was able to get, fortunate enough to work in ONGC, that gave me the building block of who I am today.
And after ONGC, you did move on to a new role with a new company, a company that you spent many years with.
Yeah.
How would you say the culture differed? How would you see the transition was? And
a lot. I joined Schlumberger. I was actually chased out of ONGC by Schlumberger. They kind of sought me out, and I joined them in Mumbai initially as head of their Mumbai operations, finance head for the operations. And the culture was very different in the two organizations. I think for me, coming from sort of an Indian background, having worked in the public sector company, and those days multinationals were not all that prevalent, right? So for me, the first cultural transition was transitioning myself from lakhs and crores to millions and hundreds of millions and billions, right? So I think that at a very trivial sense, but the work culture in the multinational companies, especially in Schlumberger, I felt was not only fast paced but actually quite empowering
Right.
In some ways. So you were given a task, you were given a goal, and you could pretty much go around, doing whatever it takes to meet that goal, right?
Right.
Of course, there was a certain sense of what the boundaries were in terms of the controlled processes, but within that, you were not seeking approvals every day to do what you were doing, which was very different for me when I came out of ONGC, because there everything is sort of
Right.
has to be approved or has a formal process to it. You have to note down your decision making process, and you have to leave a lot of track. So I felt that the work was more productive, was more fast paced, was more empowering, and I think from a personal side, it was a lot more sort of higher level. It develops you quite a bit.
Understood.
Yeah.
So, just taking a backtrack real quick for our viewers, Schlumberger is a multinational oil and gas extraction company. They're hired out by companies that you would know, such as BP, Shell, to operate the oil rigs that take out the oil, and you were in the financial sector of that company. So, you mentioned how once you moved to a company which was less domestic and more international, the pace started to change. So did that change the amount of pressure that was on you? How did that change the demand you had? Obviously, you mentioned that you were given the freedom to work at your discretion, but how did that change what was demanded of you?
Significantly, I would say. I think the work life balance changes actually quite dramatically. You, but at that time I wasn't really, I didn't have a family. I was single, so I kind of welcomed that change. There was a lot of ownership of what you did, and I actually enjoyed that quite a bit. So there was a lot of self motivation that comes out. But I was probably working, twice as many hours as I was working at ONGC, and delivering results, right? And the whole sort of, the process of achieving and the satisfaction that you get out of it drives your motivation even more. So once you taste the success, once you know how and what success looks like, it drives your motivation forward even in a bigger way, right? So I would like to say that it was a positive change.
And how would Schlumberger incentivize those goals through human resources? Would it be would the task be as such that you would see a meaningful change within the corporation, or would it be through a bonus structure? So how would the company as a whole, how would the bigger organization behind Schlumberger, how did they motivate employees such as yourself to meet those goals and find value out of that?
Yeah. So I think we get goals, and Schlumberger is actually organization which is managed by objectives, right? So at the beginning of the year, you handed out some challenging objectives, challenging but achievable. We call them SMART. They are quite specific, they are measurable and achievable, both realistic and time driven at the same time.
Right.
So we get SMART goals, we get assessed on those goals at the end of the year. And then based on that, that reflects in your performance. Of course, there is an incentive program that drives, some of the financial side of the benefit. But I think, even more than the financial benefit was this continuous cycle of development that Schlumberger actually really practiced. And as you are assessed on your goals, as your skill set builds, the company actually moves you to different geographical settings or different roles with incremental level of responsibility.
Right.
So comes with every sort of achievement comes a reward, right? Some of that reward, of course, is financial, but I think the biggest part of the reward is your career direction that it takes, right? So that's how Schlumberger drove a lot of motivation amongst its employees, and people continue to stay on. I mean, I stayed on with Schlumberger for 30 years.
Right, understood.
Yeah.
And you mentioned how one of the big driving factors was the incremental change in location and in responsibility. You were area managers for multiple regions.
Yeah.
How would being a manager for a whole region differ, and how would that change the people you were interacting with, and how did that make you adapt your managerial style?
Significantly, I would say. I think, my career, if I may just give you a very high level overview, obviously started in India. I was the chief accountant there, moved into several Middle East countries. At that time, my role was still a financial manager sort of a role until I became the controller. Schlumberger has this position of controller, which is much more of a business partner, head of the financial unit in a particular country or geography. And then I continued my journey from there on. In between, Schlumberger gave me opportunities to branch out really into other interesting roles. I set up supply chain in an entire Middle East and Asia region spanning across 30 countries. Came back to finance, continued to take responsibilities for additional geographies or bigger geographies across different regions. I worked in Middle East, in Europe, in Africa, India, of course, and US. And then I was also given responsibility to run the P&L. So I was a line manager for a few years, and I ran a global seismic business focused in marine. So that kind of mixture of different opportunities and experiences, of course, exposes you to different cultures, right? So a cultural construct that I had, at the beginning, entirely changed by the time I went through those roles, and especially when you get exposed to regions like Africa, Middle East, those places are culturally quite different, and one has to take the time to be able to understand those cultures and become effective in those cultures, right? So that I think is the biggest learning point personally that I had from this exposure, which spanned across all of these countries. Right?
And to be effective and understand, how long would you say that would take? And were there any struggles, any personal struggles, any actual anecdotes you have that may help someone understand what the adversity could present when you have to adapt your managerial style to different cultures which you're not accustomed to?
Yeah, let's take an example of Africa. I moved into that role right after constructing a supply chain for Schlumberger across Middle East and Asia, which was largely focused in Middle East and Asia, and until then I had not worked so much into the African continent. I went there, and there was a lot of pressure at the time in terms of implementation of Sarbanes-Oxley Act, right? It had just come in, and all the big corporations had to qualify. Africa was actually one of the larger operations of Schlumberger, and very material for them to be able to gain qualification. We had to qualify there. We were going through a business system transition at that time. We were moving and implementing a new ERP system. And of course, we were struggling a bit in that region because of the scarcity or paucity of some of the talent pool that we had. So one of the first goal I had was to be able to identify talent and make sure that we can harness that local talent to be able to do a better job, to be able to basically create an organization with functional depth. Of course, there were a lot of Africans who were well qualified, and most of them had actually left Africa. They were there in UK, in Europe, in many countries, and in some cases even in US.
Right.
And we had to actually come up with a new sort of package system to be able to attract that talent back, so that we can actually bring those people who were more culturally aligned with the region to be able to now identify local talent, train that local talent. We created a center of excellence in one of the countries, and where we started to now embody all the different functional expertise that were needed for us to be able to create a cohesive organization, a well-trained organization. And ultimately we ended up setting up actually quite a high-performing team. We qualified SOX, no material deficiency noted, which was a big win for the corporation at that time. But understanding that cultural construct, understanding how talent can be recruited retain, and how you can use some of train the trainer type of uh, you know tactic or a strategy to be able to develop further local talent and have a deeper expertise into the organization was something new to me. I hadn't had to do that before, and it came sort of naturally at the time given the challenge, and that also kind of changed me as a person, because now I was able to manage through people, right? That was one of my first experience where I structured a team, and in that structuring process, I was able to actually create a talent management process itself within the function. So that was a great experience.
And to build on that, it shows a sign of creativity, which often isn't exemplified in the corporate world. And creativity is often overdone by adaptiveness, which is a more useful word for the situation. But as your career progressed, you did, as you say, Schlumberger has incremental.
Yeah, roles. I mean, different
Yeah.
functional roles
Roles.
that they gave me. So let me, talk a little bit further
Sure.
about my, different ventures and the interesting ones. I think the most interesting role that I did was, as I was said, I actually spent quite a bit of years in seismic business. Right,
Okay.
initially went to seismic business in the finance role. I was a North America controller. That was my first job actually in US. Again, a very different sort of cultural exposure.
Yeah.
Not having worked here before. Through that, I took a couple of changes or elevations within the function, and I replaced my own boss. So I became the CFO of the seismic business now. This time based in UK.
Yeah.
So I moved to London, and then I became actually very involved in the understanding of the underlying subsurface technologies that seismic employs, because that's where the value is created into the business. And I became aware of a lot of opportunities where incremental efficiencies and could be sought out, by changing the direction and marrying your technology strategy with the business strategy. And I became actually quite passionate about that. I was quite vocal about that, and I was given an opportunity to then really take over the marine seismic role, which was a line management role.
Yeah.
Quite a big business, about $1.5 billion sort of business, about 2,000 people employed there, 23 ocean going vessels,
Yeah.
with people on it. So taking over that role and transforming that business into much more of an efficient and profitable machine.
Yeah.
And that was a role where obviously I was completely out of my depth in terms of my underlying knowledge of subsurface technologies, because of course I've been gaining a lot of common knowledge as a financial person would
Yeah.
in my previous roles, but I was never going to become a chief geophysicist or a
Yeah.
chief geologist in a company. So obviously I was managing now a larger cross-functional team, which included components of technology, components of business, component of fleet management, components of QHSNE, which was actually a big responsibility and weight on your shoulder.
Right.
Because in marine seismic sort of environment, you have 2,000 people floating on these vessels whose lives actually you're responsible for to
Right.
make sure that the QHSNE standards that are promoted into the company really are answering the business needs and answering, giving the kind of support that is needed, the safety that is needed to the people, right? And so all kind of those issues were absolutely new, but a lot of learning experience in a very fast-paced environment. And we did transform that business. We had excellent results. We created 40% improvement in our productivity at the end of that assignment, and then I moved on from that. So I think the point here is, your cultural exposure, or let's say the diversity in your exposure, is not only limited to geographical diversity, but also in terms of diverse functional streams.
Right.
So when you get exposed to a little bit of technology and how people think like that, a little bit of an operational issues, I think the diversity and the challenge that came to managing the safety and quality was absolutely life-changing experience
Right.
for me.
And it does outline like another arm of the corporate world, which is that many misconceptions that my generation may have when entering university and just entering the workforce is that the people who are in the workforce, people who have had decades of experience, they don't bounce around industries like the media would like to have you believe. It takes years of specialization and understanding the business. So when you move and you switch to a different industry altogether, it's hard to understand, even as somebody in finance, how different movements can have effects on your arm of the business.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about, you spoke about controlling a exponential growth of people, thousands of employees. You obviously, as you climb the ranks, your amount of time that you have to spend at the desk doing work is kind of a concave down graph. You hit a peak, and then at a point you hit a certain level where you can start to take more control. But the responsibility is obviously an exponential growth, which continues to grow as you climb the ranks, because it goes from 10 people to 200 people to 2,000 people that you're working under. And with that, the people who are above you become smaller and smaller. Who were the people who demanded results from you? People who were expected to please, in a way.
Yeah, I think it changes through your career. I think earlier in your career, you could point towards a specific manager level or a boss who would be giving out, rolling out work to you and defining, what needs to be really achieved. And I think you progress in the career through the middle and the top ranks. A lot of this becomes a bit of a collaborative process, right? You are actually part of defining what those goals ought to be, right?
Yeah.
Because taking the example of seismic business, I was the CFO of the seismic business and reporting really into the corporate Schlumberger.
Yeah.
They would actually look towards me to be able to lay out what should be achieved from the business, because
Right.
the knowledge of the seismic business resides in the seismic business, and
Yeah.
I was already heading that, right? Now, of course, there are corporate goals. There are boards. There are senior management teams that get involved in reviewing that process. But then, your participation in defining that process actually increases quite a bit, right?
Yeah.
I want to come back on the comment that you made that your career peaks at a time, and then you start to take roles which are may appear from a distance to be with smaller responsibility in terms of the number of people or the business size, etc. Well, it's a career direction. Those roles actually can be even more challenging than the previous ones, right?
Mm-hmm.
So from the seismic business, I went back to support some of the very explosive growth businesses in Schlumberger. And one of the things that I did was I actually went into the automation business. So initially as the finance person, I was the vice president finance, where Schlumberger actually ventured out and created a drilling automation business. We took what was available within Schlumberger and started to acquire companies to now fill some of the technology gaps that we had to be able to build what we call a rig of the future model, which was essentially seeking how to automate the drilling of the wells process, which actually we renamed that to well construction process, to be more fair, because in a well construction, really, you're not only drilling, you're also constructing the well. There are many other allied services that comes through. And I did that. Now here, again, I was out of depth with some of the technologies that I had learned through my career, and the last 8 years that I had spent in seismic, was useful, but not directly contributing towards what I was about to do. So we were filling technology gaps, so you have to have a fair amount of an idea about the technology and why those gaps, and then coming up with a valuation analysis of the company that you want to acquire and how would that fit into your business model. So after spending 3.5 years into that business, I was so motivated with the automation business and its impact in the oil and gas that I moved into another joint venture which Schlumberger was creating with Rockwell Automation, this time into the production domain, right?
Wow.
So here I went initially as a CFO and I became the Chief Finance and Operating Officer. So I took two roles, but again, the passion of creating value, the passion of creating that efficiency and productivity advantage, the passion that I had towards creating consistency in operation really led me towards those businesses. So I think they were equally challenging, although in terms of the business size, they were smaller because they were more or less like new startups within the corporate environment. And they had the look and feel of that startup, by the way. We were pretty much given a lot of relaxed environment to work in from a controls perspective and so on. And we ended up taking quite a few leaps into that space.
Understood.
Yeah.
And you exited the workspace at a time where a lot of people were exiting. When looking back at the span of the last 3-4 decades, how has technology changed? You mentioned that you were part of the automation of the wells and the drilling operation. But as simply behind the desk, as a managerial standpoint, when you're dealing with all these people, how does technology play a factor? Because obviously there was no Teams or Outlook when you began as your first regional role.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, a lot of world technologies are moving into the digital space, have been moving now for quite some time, different industries at different pace. So the advent of, the computer science and the softwares and more and more now in terms of machine learning and artificial intelligence has completely changed the landscape of technology and how that can be applied to various workflows or managing various companies' operations. So that one single theme, I think, is common across all industries, I believe, because all of those industries are now trying, to consume what that technology advent has been and how best to adapt that and adopt that into their core business processes. So that's one thing I've seen. I think the technology application and the user interfaces are becoming simpler to that extent. The technology is focused about simplifying tasks. The back end may be very complex, but the front end of the technology is all about supportive, bringing, talent management in, bringing people in. How do you replace now a 20 years old driller who has gained a lot of course, knowledge and experience in terms of encountering different well conditions and so on? Once you actually define all of that into a workflow and you have the right algorithms and you have, the automation software is giving you guidance, you're now able to bring in a young driller and be able to take that person through a career progression path without having necessarily to go through the same pains, right? As a 20-year-old driller went through, right? So again, I think this is no option. I think today's talent pool is not available and willing to go through that process. That was the hard process before. People are actually looking at the technology content in their jobs. So I think that has become a fundamental premise for which you attract talent into the company. And every company is doing that. Schlumberger is no different. I think the way Schlumberger consumes technologies today is very different from when I started or with the company. And I would say, why single out Schlumberger? I think oil and gas, and I think oil and gas still has a lot of ways to go
Absolutely.
in terms of automating, in terms of applying these modern technologies to the business workflows to make things safer, to make things more productive, to make them much more efficient.
Absolutely. And just as a general wrap up, you exited in 2020, right? Or 2021. A, a landscape in the world which we've never seen before. And since then, businesses have been reconstructing. Schlumberger, for example, got rid of almost 30% of employees in that time. What would you say is the landscape looking like moving forward? How would you say COVID, obviously downsizing a lot of business, how did it help reconstruct? And obviously, because a lot of companies had to take a step back, it gave them more space to move forward in the world of technology, for example. How would you say COVID and the pandemic has played a role in business moving forward?
Yeah. So by the way, I exited actually in 2023, so it's been about a year. So I went through the pandemic in the joint venture role that I talked about, where I was actually running the operations in addition to finance at the time and during the COVID period. So I actually saw that up close. I think it has changed corporate philosophies in many ways. I think the first change it has done is it has broken down previous myths where we always thought that the work can only be carried inside the confines of four walls, right? Inside an office space. I think most organizations, even running critical operations, were able to actually survive with a lot of people working from home, right? And not only survive, I would say there were a lot of examples there where the organizations were able to actually thrive in that period, right? So that understanding of how work can be differently executed, how collaboration can differently be done, enabled through some of the latest technologies. I think the first sort of biggest learning that has come out of COVID. The second learning is the work-life balance. I think this COVID and the way we had to operate, not by choice, but by compulsion at that time, has completely redefined the work-life balance parameters. Right now, today's talent pool is not going to significantly roll back the work-life balance equation that changed, right? So the flexibility is going to be some of the key. Now, I'm a strong believer that some of the time needs to be spent in person in order to develop the core sort of skills that are needed in the company. But working on this hybrid environment is something that seems to be emerging as a sweet spot, right? And I actually quite support that. I think that brings even more productivity out of people, which COVID has absolutely proven that you could do that without the loss of productivity. So a lot of organizations are in search of what is the right sort of operating model for them, and it has given a lot of options in terms of changing cost dynamics at the same time, right? Because when you are able to live with this construct, right, you are now more relaxed about the location of the people and where they need to be in order to be able to remotely or virtually collaborate. So you can even take some advantage out of it as a corporate. Also, at the same time, the individuals could be in more cost-friendly environment, or to be able to address some of their family issues as one has, especially when they have young families and so on. So I think these are the things which are new challenges, and the organizations are finding their own rhythm and balance. I think time is going to tell whether we are going to go completely virtual office. I, for one, do not believe that's healthy. But a hybrid approach is definitely here to stay, and I think this is the way to go.
Great. Well, that's all I have. Thank you so much for taking the time. And
Pleasure.
thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Good luck with your project.
Thank you so much.